This is Killer Prompt. A new story starts now.
Chapter 4. Response. The change in the clearing was no longer something I could measure in feet or inches. It had shifted in character. Up to that point, every adjustment, every widening, had carried a kind of restraint. The alterations had been controlled, incremental, almost careful in the way they presented themselves. Even when they defied explanation, they did so with a pattern that suggested limits. The restraint was gone. The opening behind the house no longer read as a corridor or even an intrusion into the forest. It resolved into something broader, more deliberate, a space that no longer needed to conceal its purpose. The trees at its edges stood back in a way that felt less like clearing and more like repositioning, as though they had been arranged rather than removed. The light behaved differently within it. I noticed as I stood at the window, looking out across the yard. The sunlight didn't simply pass through the clearing, it settled into it, filling the space in a way that flattened the surrounding depth. The usual layering of distance, the subtle shifts in color and shadow that distinguished foreground from background felt diminished. Everything beyond the edge of the clearing seemed closer, or perhaps more accurately, less defined by distance at all. I stepped outside, not with the same tentative awareness I had carried the day before, but with a clearer sense of purpose. The hesitation had been replaced by something else. Not confidence exactly, but familiarity. Enough had happened now that I understood the basic structure of this interaction. Observation, response, adjustment. What I didn't yet understand was the extent of it. I walked toward the clearing at a measured pace, paying attention not just to what I could see, but to what I could feel. The shift in the air was still there, the slight drop in temperature, the compression of sound, but it had deepened. The boundary I had crossed the day before felt less like a threshold now and more like a gradient, something that extended outward rather than existing as a single point. As I moved closer, I became aware of something else. The devices. Now that I had recognized the first one, the others became easier to see, because I knew what to look for. Subtle interruptions in the natural patterns of bark and shadow, surfaces that absorbed light differently, shapes that held their position too precisely against the irregular lines of the trees. There were more of them now. Or perhaps there always had been. Either way, they were no longer limited to the deeper edge of the clearing. They extended inward, closer to the house, positioned at intervals that suggested coverage rather than placement. A network. Not dense, but complete. I stopped a few steps short of where I had entered the day before and turned slowly, mapping their positions relative to one another. Each device maintained the same behavior as the first, orientation defined by me rather than by any fixed axis. As I shifted, they adjusted, their attention aligning without visible movement. It wasn't invasive or aggressive. It was thorough. "You're expanding," I said quietly. The words felt less like speculation and more like confirmation. There was no immediate response, but the awareness of being observed intensified, not in pressure, but in clarity. Whatever system was operating here was no longer simply reacting to my presence, it was incorporating it. I stepped fully into the clearing again. This time, the sense of registration came faster, cleaner, less ambiguous. I didn't pause to examine the ground or the edges of the cut vegetation. Instead, I moved deeper into the space, testing how far the effect extended. With each step, the same subtle shift in perception followed. Sound flattening, distance compressing, the environment aligning itself in a way that felt less natural and more corrected. Halfway to the center, I stopped. Not because I had reached a limit, but because something else had drawn my attention. Movement. Not in the clearing itself, but beyond it, in the darker line of trees that marked the beginning of the denser forest. At first, it was nothing more than a suggestion, a slight inconsistency in the way the vertical lines of the trunks held against one another. The kind of thing you might dismiss if you weren't really looking for it. I shifted my position slightly, trying to isolate the source. The movement stopped. That, more than anything, made it noticeable. Natural motion carries through. Wind doesn't stop because you notice it. Animals don't freeze without a reason. This was not either of those. I waited. The clearing remained still around me, the devices maintaining their quiet alignment, their attention fixed. Then the movement returned, slow and measured, not crossing from one point to another, but adjusting within a space, as though something were repositioning itself without leaving the area it occupied. I narrowed my focus, letting the rest of the environment fall away until all that remained was the narrow section of forest where the inconsistency had appeared. That's when I realized something else. The devices weren't tracking it. Every visible unit remained oriented toward me, maintaining the same precise alignment they had held since I entered the clearing. There was no shift, no recalibration, no indication that whatever I was seeing had registered within the system at all. I turned slightly, testing the assumption. The devices followed me. Not the movement beyond the clearing's edge. Me. Interesting, I said under my breath. The word felt insufficient, but accurate. If the system could track me with this level of precision, then the absence of response to that movement wasn't a limitation. It was a choice. I took a step toward the edge of the clearing. The movement in the trees deepened. Not faster or larger, just more present. The vertical line I'd been watching began to resolve into something that almost suggested form. Not a figure, not in any way that could be clearly defined, but an interruption in the pattern that held its position even as my perspective shifted. I moved to the left, then to the right, trying to force parallax, trying to separate foreground from background. The shape didn't behave correctly. It didn't move independently of the trees, but it didn't remain fixed to them either. It seemed to exist within the space rather than in front of or behind it, an absence of consistency rather than the presence of form. I felt my focus tighten, not out of fear, but out of recognition. "This isn't part of you," I said. Every device in the clearing shifted, not gradually, not with any visible transition. One moment they were aligned with me, the next, they weren't. The collective attention of the system reoriented toward the same section of forest I had been watching. The effect was instantaneous and absolute, as though a single command had been issued across the entire network. The air changed with it. The pressure I had felt before, the subtle awareness of observation, tightened into something more focused, more specific. It wasn't directed at me anymore. It was directed outward. At the same point, the shape in the trees held for a fraction of a second longer. Then it was gone. Gone in a way that left no residual indication that it had ever been there. The trees returned to their original alignment. The depth corrected. The inconsistency vanished. And for a moment, nothing moved. Then, just as abruptly as it had shifted away from me, the system returned its attention. The devices realigned. The air relaxed. The clearing resumed its prior state as though the interruption had been acknowledged and dismissed. I remained where I was, letting the sequence settle into something I could understand. The system was capable of tracking more than just my movement. It could respond collectively. It could prioritize. And whatever I had seen, it had recognized as something requiring its attention. I turned slowly, taking in the full span of the clearing again. The house behind me, the devices embedded in the trees, the now still forest beyond. This wasn't random. It wasn't malfunction. It was structured. A process with parameters I was only beginning to understand. I exhaled slowly, letting the last of the tension leave my shoulders. "All right," I said. The word felt different this time. Not tentative, not reactive. It carried the weight of a decision. I stepped forward again, moving deeper into the clearing, past the point where I had stopped before, and to the center of the space that had been shaped so precisely around me. I didn't move once I got there. I stood still, waiting. It didn't take long. A faint light flickered high in the trees, subtle enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't been looking for it. It pulsed once, then again, its rhythm slow and controlled. I raised my hand slightly, shielding my eyes as I readjusted my focus. The light responded, not by moving, by aligning. It tracked the angle of my hand, adjusting its intensity in a way that suggested calibration rather than illumination. I lowered my hand. The light dimmed, paused, then pulsed once more. The meaning wasn't clear, but it was enough. Acknowledgement. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with a sense of confirmation that settled deeper than anything I had felt so far. "I see you," I said. The words felt unnecessary. The system already knew. The light pulsed again. Behind me, from somewhere inside the house, I heard the faint, unmistakable sound of a door opening. I froze. I didn't turn around. Not because I was afraid of what I might see, but because I understood what this moment represented. Up to this point, the interaction had been external. Observation and response. Input and output. Now, it was extending inward. I stood there for a moment longer, the clearing quiet around me, the system attentive in a way that no longer felt passive. Then I turned and walked back to the house.
Want the full files? Our Patreon gets early stories, exclusive drops, hidden lore, and access to the darker corners of KillerPrompt. Don't forget to leave questions or story suggestions in the comments below and help shape their narrative. The line has been cleared, the boundary has been crossed, but KillerPrompt is still listening. We'll see you at the next clearing.